Parents, what's the most bone-chilling thing your child has ever said that scared you to your core? I used to live in South Texas on a small Navy base in Flower Bluff. My two young boys at the time used to wake my wife and me frequently, claiming all kinds of paranormal things were happening. I won't lie, the place was creepy as all hell. We started finding glasses with different amounts of water left randomly around the house. I asked my oldest about it, and he said it was my younger boy's thing because he was helping a friend. So my wife and I asked him, "What's with the glasses?" He told us, "I leave them out for the black man. He doesn't want to spit all his water on our floor." My wife asked, "Black man? Like a shadow?" He shook his head no and said black like a friend from school, then added, "Whenever he tries to speak, he just coughs and spits up water." That's pretty freaky to hear from a 4-year-old. Fast forward a few years, and we were having a family discussion about the house being haunted. My sons did some research and found out there had been a hurricane in the area. In 1900, the worst hurricane America had seen until Andrew hit Florida. Thousands of people died, mostly from drowning. The government bought the land shortly after, cleaned it up, and it eventually became NAS Flower Bluff. My younger son still remembers seeing the water ghost and says that if he were a better artist, he could draw him as easily as he could draw us. My older son says he mostly remembers the noises and telling them to stop, only for them to start again a few minutes later. We all saw shadow figures. The boys also told us that kids on their school bus talked about their own sightings, which seemed to happen pretty often. Story 2. This was a few years ago. My son would have been around 7. A little backstory. My husband worked maintenance for apartments and townhouses and cleaned them out after deaths or evictions. Sometimes he would keep items. Once, he found a beautiful cross and brought it home. We hung the cross by our back entryway. Shortly after, within days, we noticed odd occurrences. Things being moved, lights left on, but we didn't think too much of it. One night after putting my son to sleep, I could hear noises and talking when he should have been asleep. I went to check on him to see why he wasn't sleeping. As I was going up the stairs, it suddenly got quiet. When I reached his room, he appeared to be sleeping. I went to leave, and my son suddenly sat up and asked me why I was letting the man keep him up. I told him there was no one there and to go back to sleep. He pointed behind me and said the man was right there, that he hadn't left, and asked if I could take him with me. I spun around, but no one was there. This went on for a few weeks. At the same time, our dog would sit by the back entryway and stare at the wall, sometimes barking. The cross would also often be upside down when we passed by. We got rid of the cross and things went back to normal. Story 3. When I was a lot younger, my mother stayed home with my brother and me while our dad was at work. The house we lived in was always kind of strange. You'd hear things moving around or voices in the middle of the night, almost paranormal. We lived in a fairly large suburban home. My brother and I shared a large room on the 3rd floor, which had a stairway inside the room that led up to the attic door. The attic itself was terrifying. It was about 20 by 20 feet, with an old wooden floor surrounded by pink fiberglass insulation. There was no light and no windows, just boxes from when my parents had moved in, and a large, dark open shaft in one corner. It looked like something straight out of a murder movie and creeped everyone out so much that no one ever had the nerve to look down the shaft to see where it led. I was told that when I was around 4 or 5, with my brother being 2 or 3, my mother would hear someone crying in the house, sometimes trying to talk through sobbing. Whenever she went to investigate, there was nothing there. One day, I apparently told her there was a man in the attic and that he was sitting in the corner crying. She immediately took my brother and me and drove us to her mother's house. I don't remember saying this, but whatever I told her made her afraid to be home alone until we eventually moved. Story 4. When I was about 3, my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner and could hear me chatting away. She assumed I was talking to the TV, but when she stepped into the living room, the TV was off. She asked who I was talking to. I apparently pointed at the wall and said, "That man?" She asked, "What man?" And I replied, that man, right there." She was freaked out. I also remember seeing scary faces in the corner of my bedroom at night, but I always thought it was just me being a silly kid afraid of the dark. Then, over Christmas break in 2012, I'm 23 now, I was staying at my parents' house. At about 1 a.m., just as I was drifting off to sleep, I felt like someone was watching me. I was lying on the side of the bed, closest to the corner where I used to see the scary faces. I opened my eyes and found myself less than a foot away from a bearded man staring directly at me. Needless to say, I was terrified. I jumped backward in bed, but when I looked again, no one was there. I know I wasn't dreaming, but I calmed myself down and decided I must have imagined it. The next morning, I told my brother about the bearded man I saw, and he said, "Oh, you saw the bearded man too? That really freaked me out." My younger brother, who is 21, says that for years he has seen the bearded man standing in different places in his bedroom, watching him. He had never told me or anyone else about it before. Story 5. I've got one. There's a huge cemetery in a neighboring city that I used to love visiting before I had kids. The Black Dahlia, among many others, is buried there. A few years ago, when my son was 3 and my daughter was 1, I randomly decided one morning that we would go there to walk around a bit and have a picnic lunch. I told my husband my plan, packed up lunch, the mom bag, the kids, and headed out. On the way there, my son asked where we were going, and I told him we were going to walk through a park and have a picnic. I did not tell him it was a cemetery, or that people who had passed away were buried there. We arrived and drove past the administrative buildings and the big fountain. As we headed uphill, I took a turn that led past some of the oldest graves. As we rounded a bend, my son said, "Mommy, do you see all the people?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I asked, "What people?" Keep in mind, there wasn't a single living person outside of my car. He replied, "All the people on the hill waving at me." I looked around and saw no one. I hadn't seen anyone since we entered the grounds. I told him, "No, buddy, I can't see the people. But just because Mommy can't see them doesn't mean they might not be there. Let's go have lunch somewhere else so we don't bother them." And I basically noped the hell out of there. I have no idea what my son may have been seeing, but like I said to him, just because I couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't there. If he really was seeing people waving at him that I couldn't see, I have no idea whether they were friendly or not. And yeah, screw that. And now I am thoroughly creeped out. Story 6. I don't have kids, but I do have a story. I should say up front that I'm a religious person, but in this situation I was the one taking a fact-based, common-sense approach. I had a friend with 2 kids, one 5 years old and one 8. She always seemed to have a hard time wherever she lived. Doors slamming, things being moved, toys turning on by themselves, lights flickering. Eventually she moved into one house that she was convinced was haunted, and all of this seemed to happen there regularly. I tried to calm her down, explaining that the house was old. Pipes creak, wiring ages, lights flicker, floors are uneven so doors move, and she had kids, which explained things being out of place. One night, a few days after she had smudged the house, a Native American ritual meant to cleanse spiritual energy, she put the kids to bed, and we were sitting at the kitchen table. It was about midnight, and her 5-year-old son had been asleep for a few hours. Suddenly, he was standing in the kitchen doorway. We hadn't heard him come up the stairs at all. He was just staring at us. She asked him sternly what he was doing up and whether he needed to use the bathroom, but he didn't respond. He just stared. Then, after about half a minute, 30 long, uncomfortable seconds, he said, "Not gone, not gone, not gone," over and over, getting louder and louder until he was screaming. Then he abruptly stopped, turned around, and went back downstairs to bed. I was definitely shaken. After that, I started spending less time at her house, especially at night. It just didn't feel right. Even though I hadn't believed it was haunted at first, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling after that. Story 7. I was nannying a little boy, around 6 or 7, for the first time. I like to get to know the kids in the home by letting them give me a tour. He showed me his mom's bedroom, and that's when I first noticed a shrine in the corner with waxed-down candles. I assumed it was a Hindu or Buddhist tribute and moved on. As we continued, I realized there was almost nothing in this huge house. Seriously, it was empty. The living room had only a single couch. The emptiness made the house echo and feel unnervingly cold. There were crayon drawings all over the walls, clearly done by both him and his mom. Then I noticed a giant red pentagram drawn far above the stairs, way too high for a young child to reach. I'm a firm believer that you can invite spirits, or demons, whatever you call them, into a home. And being in that cold, empty house with a huge pentagram on the wall made me more than a little on edge. Later that night, during bath time, the boy suddenly stopped playing with his toys. He jolted upright, gasped, and asked, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. "The front door. It opened. Someone's here," he whispered. Then he went back to playing as if nothing had happened. I ran out of the bathroom to check if his mom had come home. The front door, which was on a landing below, was shut but unlocked. I swear I felt like something was watching me as I sprinted to the door and locked it. When I went back to him, I asked how he knew someone was there, but I was clearly interrupting his playtime. He just kept insisting that someone had opened the front door and was there. We spent the rest of the night locked in his room. I never babysat for them again. Story 8. Not a parent, but this is something I remember from when I was a kid, and my mom still brings it up from time to time. When I was around 8, we lived in a duplex. All the bedrooms were on the second floor, and the living room, kitchen, and everything else were on the first. My mom would often fall asleep in the rocking chair downstairs while waiting for my dad to get off work. Whenever I couldn't sleep, I'd go down and sleep with her in the chair. One night, I went downstairs and saw what I thought was my mom sitting in the rocking chair. It was dark, so I didn't question it at first. But when I got closer, her eyes started glowing bright red. I ran back upstairs to my mom's room, crept up to her bed as slowly as possible to make sure it was really her, and woke her up. I told her there was a shadow person sitting in the rocking chair, pretending to be her. It still creeps me out when I think about it today. Story 9. So, I have a 4-year-old daughter, but she was about 1.5 at the time. She was just starting to talk, but clearly enough for us to understand what she wanted. Since she was born, she always wanted to be with her grandpa, my dad. Whenever we visited my parents, she never wanted to leave. One Sunday, she threw an especially dramatic tantrum when we left, and was still crying when we got home. At that moment, I was alone with her, and she made me lose my cool. I started yelling, telling her that we couldn't always be with my parents, that we had our own house and had to live in it. I was getting pretty loud. Right in the middle of her sobbing, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "No, you don't yell at me. I am your grandmother. I miss my son." My grandmother had died a few years before my daughter was born. For some backstory, my grandmother always told me that we were soulmates. She believed we had met in many other lives and that we would keep meeting again. When she was close to dying, she told me not to mourn for her, that we would meet again. She specifically said, "Next time, I'm going to be your daughter, so you take care of me this time around." It still gives me chills. Story 10. Not a parent, but I was staying at my aunt and uncle's house for Thanksgiving. They gave me the guest bedroom. The first night, right before their 3 or 4-year-old son went to bed, he told me, "The shadow man likes to look at people in the bed from the closet at night, but don't worry, he won't hurt you." I tried not to think much of it, but when I lay down that night, I couldn't get it out of my head. Eventually, I moved a chair in front of the closet door so it couldn't open. After that, I managed to fall asleep. The next day around lunch, the kid casually said, "The shadow man couldn't open the closet door last night, so he looked out of the air vent instead." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had noticed the chair somehow and made it up. But I still didn't get much sleep that night. Story 11. My daughter just turned 1, so she isn't saying much yet. Since she was born, though, she's reacted to things I can't see, tracking something with her eyes, smiling and giggling at nothing, waving, things like that. I nurse her in my bed before putting her to sleep in her crib. Every night, at exactly the same time, and I mean exactly, I've actually been keeping track, she unlatches, stands up, walks to the end of the bed, and starts waving at no one. I'll say, "There's nobody there. Come nurse." She turns to look at me and very slowly, very deliberately shakes her head, no, with this strange grin on her face. She kinda scares me. Story 12. I've got a few stories. When my little cousin was just starting to form more complex thoughts and sentences, he was sitting on my grandfather's lap. He suddenly got a strange look in his eye, looked at my grandfather, and said, "No exaggeration. When you were younger, I used to bounce you on my knee." We asked him what he meant. "Don't you remember living on the farm?" My grandfather went completely white. He had grown up on a farm, but almost no one knew that. He'd largely forgotten that part of his life after his time in Vietnam, following some very intense debriefing methods used after his service as a special forces sniper. That same cousin also told me that he used to run through sunny fields when he was a little girl with pigtails before he died. Apparently, I did similar things at around the same age. I was on a train with my cousins, grandparents, and my mom, heading to visit my great-grandfather, and I wouldn't stop talking about the train I had conducted before, through hills and mountains. I also talked about fishing and hunting at my favorite spot, a small island beneath a cliff on a lake. I don't remember any of that. My brother once pointed out our uncle, who had died before either of us were born, in a wedding photo my parents owned. He calmly explained that it was the scary man who comes and watches us at night. That part, I do remember, sort of. I remember seeing a man standing very close to our bunk beds, blocking the doorway. He was slightly see-through. The house we lived in then, and still live in now, is the same house my dad and uncle grew up in as children. Story 13. My kids were staying with my best friend when her great-aunt died. We stayed at her aunt's house the night of the funeral. I was putting my 2 sons to bed on the hide-a-bed in the living room. There were still quite a few people around, since everyone had gathered there after the funeral. My second oldest son was about 3 or 4 at the time. He looked at me and said, "I thought Aunt Louie died." I told him she had, and that the funeral we went to was for her. He replied, "But she's standing right there," and pointed to a dark corner of the dining room. I asked him if it scared him that she was there, and he said it scared him a little. I told him to ask her to leave because he was afraid, so he did. After a few minutes, he said, "It's okay, she's gone now. She said she was sorry for scaring me. He also had a habit of reading my thoughts. One time, I was sitting in the van at a stoplight, thinking about going back to school. Out of nowhere, he asked me, "But what would you do with us if you went back to school?" Story 14. First, I am an atheist and generally skeptical about ghost stories, but this is my experience, and to this day, I don't know what to make of it. When I was a boy, in the 1970s, from about age 3 to 8, my family would spend 2 months every summer traveling through New England. We'd go with a coachman trailer hitched to our big green Lincoln, staying at campgrounds along the way. One regular stop was visiting Mrs. Starr on Cape Cod, and on one occasion, we stayed overnight at her house. Mrs. Starr lived near us in the Washington, D.C. area, but she had a summer home on the Cape with a quarter-mile of private beach. The house was enormous, at least 150 years old at the time, and had been in her husband's family for generations. She was a widow before I was born, and her children were grown, but upstairs she kept a room filled with giant Tinker toys and other amazing things for her grandchildren, my younger brother, and me. When I was about 6, we stayed there overnight for the first time. That night, I remember being kissed goodnight by an older man with rough cheeks who smelled like my mother's father. I've always allowed for the possibility that it was just a dream. But the next day, while my dad was out on the beach painting and my mom was downstairs with Mrs. Starr, my brother, who was 3 years younger than me, and I were playing upstairs when the door creaked open, and I caught that same familiar whiff of cologne again. I remember walking to the door, opening it, and poking my head out. I saw an old man walk into another room. I followed him, and when I looked in, he smiled and pointed toward the closet. I went over and opened it, finding a box filled with old books and knickknacks. Inside one of the books were some loose papers and a photograph of the man I had just seen. I turned around, confused, and he was gone. I ran downstairs to where my mom and Mrs. Starr were sitting and having tea. I told my mom that the man upstairs wanted me to bring something down to Mrs. Starr. They were puzzled and said there was no one else in the house. I insisted. They asked what man I was talking about. Maybe my dad? No, I said, and pointed to a photo on a shelf of Mrs. Starr and her late husband. Mrs. Starr became visibly upset. My mom, embarrassed, told me that wasn't nice to say, explaining that the man in the photo was Mr. Starr and that he had died before I was born. I insisted it was him. Then I pulled the papers and photographs out from behind my back and handed them to Mrs. Starr, telling her that he had asked me to bring them to her. I remember Mrs. Starr gasping and turning pale as she asked where I had found them. She then left the room in tears. Years later, I learned that the items were old photographs of her and her husband, including one of a child who had died young, along with missing financial papers that had long been thought lost. We never stayed in that house again, though we still visited every summer. This story is a mix of my own memories and what my mother later told me, but the core facts are true. As an atheist, it makes me deeply uncomfortable, and I have no rational explanation for it. It simply is what it is. Story 15. It wasn't my child, it was my cousin, and even now I almost hesitate to type this out, because every time I think about it, I get deeply creeped out. For some background, my aunt, uncle, and cousins lived in a very old 2-story building. They occupied the second floor. The first floor was essentially abandoned, trashed, and completely unoccupied. At the back of the building was a porch that had never been finished. The enclosed stairway leading to it stopped about 8 feet above the ground, and the enclosure was sealed off so that no one could get in or out. I was about 4 years old at the time. My cousin would have been around 8 or 9. We were in her family Josh game room, sitting at a table playing either Connect 4 or Memory. In that room was a door that led directly to the unfinished back porch and stairway I mentioned earlier. As we were playing, there was a knock at that door. My cousin jumped up excitedly and ran to open it. This detail matters. I can still remember, very clearly and vividly, what was on the other side. There were 2 little girls standing there. One was shorter, who I assumed was the younger, and the other slightly taller. Both had their hair partially pinned up, with the ends curled. They were dressed in what I can only describe as old-fashioned and fancy clothing. Nothing remotely modern, even by the standards of the time. That image has never left me. Even now, decades later, I can picture them perfectly. Fancy little girl dresses, little shoes, all white. I clearly remember them being entirely white, except for their brown hair and black eyes. I distinctly remember going from excited to terrified the instant I saw their eyes. I remember my cousin saying to them, very nonchalantly, something along the lines of, "Hi, I can't play right now. My cousin is here," and then shutting the door. She went straight back to the table to continue our game, with me following as close to her as I could get. She didn't seem alarmed or scared at all, but I was absolutely terrified. The older I get, the more unsettling this memory becomes for some reason. I have other memories of them showing up, always outside the apartment. Whenever I try to ask my cousin about it, she becomes eerily uncomfortable and denies anything ever happened. So, about that door. Fast forward about 10 years. I was probably in my teens when my dad finally decided, after much nagging from me, to tell me some ghost stories. One of them involved that same back door and led him to the frightening discovery that it had been nailed shut. He said he discovered this around the time I was an infant. I'm pretty sure that when he told me the door had been nailed shut, I turned pale white, because it made those early memories even more terrifying. I also found out about a year ago, while idiotically Googling, that there is some so-called phenomenon involving black-eyed children. Reading those accounts has only worsened the panic attacks I get when I start remembering seeing them. Story 16. When I started school, my parents bought a sprawling apartment in the suburbs of the city we had moved to from a small town. It was all very exciting for me. I was 5 and my brother was 2. The only thing my dad's friends didn't like was that the rear windows of the apartment looked out onto an old graveyard, overgrown with eucalyptus trees. I loved the new school and everything about the place. My mom soon installed blinds to cover the window, since my little brother was getting too curious. Otherwise, it was a nice neighborhood. Few neighbors, mostly because people were unsettled by the proximity of the building to the graveyard. Kids would play in the park in front, and a watchman kept an eye on them and patrolled the streets at night. We spent 4 good years there before my dad got a better job in another city, and the apartment was sold to help pay for a new home. It was the best time for the family, happy and stress-free. Now, my parents often tell stories from our childhood there at family gatherings or just around the kitchen table. I was often the butt of my dad's jokes, teased about my pretend friends. One day he was teasing me about the old woman I used to call my friend and the talking teddy bear I apparently had. I told him I didn't remember any of that. He laughed and said my obsession with books had made me believe I had a guardian everywhere. Like that watchman, he chuckled out of the blue. The watchman was real, Dad, I said. My parents laughed at me. Sure, honey, he replied. Your descriptions of him were very detailed, and he often kept you from wandering out into the streets. You used to get candies from the neighborhood kids, but you always told us the watchman gave them to you. I was flabbergasted. I distinctly remembered the watchman. He wore khaki overalls and carried a cane. He had pockmarks on his face, but underneath a thick gray mustache, he always wore a big friendly smile. He was kind and didn't talk much, but he always told me, Mom and Dad love you, and you should love your brother. He'll take care of you when he grows up. I told my dad all of this. He just laughed harder. So then I told him about the day Mom lost the house keys. We were supposed to stay at my aunt's place until he could get the lock fixed. Dad had to pick me up from the bus stop near her house. But that day, when I got off the school bus, the watchman was already there. He gave me the lost keys and told me to wait for Dad. I held his hand and stood there until my very flustered dad arrived about 10 minutes later, only to find me waiting alone. Apparently, there was no one standing with me. My parents assumed I had somehow miraculously found the keys on my own. I hadn't. I remember that day crystal clear. Mr. Watchman gave me the keys himself. His hands were warm. He had a black mole on his knuckle. I remember staring at it and calling it a bug. I can still picture it perfectly. I swear he was real. Years later, one of my dad's friend's kids lived in the same building when he started college. He boarded up the rear windows because they scared him so badly. Eventually, he told my brother that he'd seen a weird guy in overalls walking back and forth across the lane and around the park late at night while he was smoking on the balcony. Creepy man, he said, just stares at you and doesn't look away for minutes. At least my brother believed me after that. Story 17. 5 years ago, our state experienced its worst bushfires ever, killing hundreds of people from my sister's town. My sister and her family moved into a rental house that had survived the fires while their own home was being rebuilt. A few months later, my 4-year-old niece started telling her mother about a man she played with in her room. She said he liked to play and talk with her because he missed his daughter and wife, and he couldn't find them anywhere. My sister was creeped out but didn't think too much of it until she asked some neighbors about the previous residents. The neighbors told her that a man, his wife, and their young daughter had lived there. The wife and daughter had been trapped in the fires and died, and the grieving husband, unable to bear life without them, had hung himself in the backyard of the house. Story 18. I was staying at an old friend's house in the countryside, a tiny hamlet in the middle of nowhere. The family had an old German shepherd that had been with them for about 10 years and had slept in the youngest daughter's room ever since she was born. She was 5 or 6 the night I stayed over. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., the dog started barking. absolutely bellowing, and wouldn't stop. Naturally, the father rushed into the room, found nothing, and after speaking with his daughter, picked her up and carried her to his room, where she spent the rest of the night. In the morning, I asked what had been wrong and why the dog had barked so much. She looked up at me with the scariest expression I have ever seen on a little girl and said, "Because the old woman at the foot of my bed wouldn't stop screaming." Later, the family looked into who the previous owner of the house had been and were told it belonged to an old woman who had been found dead in the daughter's bedroom. Story 19. I'm not a parent, but I thought I'd share this story anyway. I was visiting my family in Oregon in December of 2011, and my aunt was putting my 2.5-year-old cousin to bed. She asked if I could tell him a bedtime story. I made one up on the spot about a little girl named Candy and her friend Rosie going on an adventure in the woods. He fell asleep pretty quickly, and since he couldn't talk at the time, he was born several months premature, I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward a year, to December of last year. My cousin was talking and playing like normal. My aunt had to run some errands and asked me to watch him for a while. I agreed and took him outside. He went quiet for a bit, then looked up at me and said, "How come Candy and Rosie aren't back from the forest?" I was surprised. I didn't think he remembered the story at all. Then he added, "There were noises last night. I think Candy and Rosie are in trouble. Maybe the bad man got them." When I asked what bad man, he just said, "The one in Grandpa's shed." By this point, I was thoroughly freaked out, but I took him into the shed to show him there wasn't anyone in there. He looked confused and stared at the wall. "He's right there." Then he picked up a shovel and weakly threw it at the wall. "Put Candy and Rosie back." I noped out hard and ran out of the shed, momentarily forgetting my cousin. About a minute later, he walked back into the house and said, "They're coming back." Story 20. I'm not a parent, but my parents have adopted 3 toddler sisters, 5 years old, 4 years old, and 2 years old. One week, I came home to stay with my parents so they could meet my girlfriend at the time, Jessica. They had never met her or even heard of her before. It was meant to be a surprise. Jessica went to visit her parents for the weekend before coming to meet mine. That first night, I was lying on the bed in the guest room, which is next to the girls' room, when I heard them murmuring. I assumed they were talking to each other, but then I distinctly heard them saying, "Jessica." The 2-year-old had a speech impediment and very limited ability to talk, so hearing her say that name immediately caught my attention. I had no idea how they could even know it. The murmuring grew louder, and suddenly the oldest yelled, "He won't! He won't!" Right after that, I heard a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. I panicked and ran into their room, afraid someone was hurt. When I opened the door, all 3 of them were standing on top of their dresser, which was far too high for the 2-year-old to have climbed on her own. They were all smiling and staring out the window. When I asked what they were doing, they turned to me, and clear as day, the 2-year-old said, "You shouldn't marry that girl." Story 21. Not a parent, but my brother was born when I was around 14. One night a few years ago, when he was about 4 or 5, I was watching him while my parents were out at some event. I don't even remember what. Out of nowhere, my brother ran out the back door into the yard. I brought him back inside, but he insisted that our dad was out there and that he needed to talk to him. I told him our parents were far away, but he kept insisting our dad was in the backyard. I even called my dad to prove it. My dad told him directly that he wasn't there, but my brother still insisted he was outside and that he had seen him. He started screaming and trying to run back out into the dark. I had to physically restrain him as best I could to keep him from going outside. After that, I checked every window in the house to see if anyone was out there. I didn't see a thing. My night vision is terrible, but I feel like I would have noticed something if someone had actually been walking around out there. I finally got him calmed down, but about half an hour later, when I went to use the bathroom, he started insisting again that our dad was outside. He said he could hear him yelling for him from the yard. I heard nothing. I checked the windows again and noticed something odd in the front yard. Near the porch, there was a styrofoam cup sitting upright that definitely hadn't been there earlier. It was pulsing with a red light. Nothing supernatural looking, just what seemed like some kind of red LED glowing from inside it. Still, it was strange. I wanted to go outside and check it out, but I couldn't get my brother to stop freaking out. About an hour later, I looked out the window again because I heard something outside. Nothing obvious, but now there were 2 more glowing red LED things in the yard. They looked like small devices, maybe big enough to hold 2 AA batteries and an LED. They were sitting in the grass, and the one inside the cup was still there. I still had no idea where they came from, and I still couldn't leave my brother alone long enough to investigate. Later, my brother insisted he saw a red dot on the wall shining through a crack in the curtains. The way he described it sounded like a laser pointer, but again, I couldn't see anyone outside. I kept checking the windows to see if I could spot someone messing with the lights or using a laser, but there was nothing. No movement, no people. When my parents finally got home, I checked again. All of the glowing LED things were gone, including the cup. I asked my parents if they had seen anything, but they said no. They suggested maybe a kid had dropped a toy and then come back for it later, but I really doubt that. The whole thing was just creepy and strange. Story 22. Not my kid, my siblings. I have 4 much younger siblings. My parents divorced and then had no more kids until they remarried. I was about 15 at the time, and babysitting a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and 2 3-year-olds. I was pissed because I had to watch them on a Friday night. I was 15. So I obviously had plans, but my parents wanted to go out. I had all of them sitting on the couch in front of me while I laid out the rules for the evening. All of a sudden, every single one of them turned their heads in the exact same direction. It was creepy, but I didn't fully process it and snarkily said, "You aren't even paying attention." That's when my 5-year-old sister said, "It doesn't matter. The man is in the kitchen." Then the twins both echoed, "Man in the kitchen. Man in the kitchen." That was it for me. We all went into my parents' bedroom and stayed there until they came home. When I asked them about it later, they all refused to say anything. To this day, none of them will talk about it. Story 23. This was a little strange for me. My cousin was almost 2 and was being babysat at my house. She was fascinated with a Jamaican flag magnet I had brought back from a holiday. She always asked me to lift her up so she could get a better look at it on the fridge door. I held her up for about a minute, then put her down, and she toddled off into the living room. I put on some cartoons, and when I came back into the kitchen, the magnet was gone. I checked the floor and even went into the living room, thinking I might have kicked it in there, but I couldn't find it anywhere. My cousin, still staring at the TV, asked, "What doing?" She couldn't form full sentences yet. I said, "I can't find the magnet," and she replied, "He put it up." I asked who he was, and she pointed to the corner of the living room, an empty corner, and repeated, "He." I was pretty freaked out at that point. A few weeks later, I had completely forgotten about the magnet. I went to grab a cereal box from the top of the fridge, and something fell down. The magnet. Story 24. One night, I heard my 5-year-old daughter crying in her room. It was about 11 p.m., so she had been asleep for several hours. I went in, gave her a hug, and asked what was wrong. She said, "Mommy, I dreamt you were eaten by the same thing that ate your mom and her sister, and you died." She was barely 5 at the time, and I had never had any discussions with her about my mother or how she died. She never even met my mother. She had met my aunt once that she could remember, and knew that she had died, but not how. Both of them died horribly from a very fast, very aggressive cancer that metastasized and, for lack of a better way to put it, ate them alive. Creepy as hell. I really hope she's wrong. Story 25. When my son could barely talk, he would see a man either in our entryway or outside his bedroom window. We had fully shuttered windows with a decorative half circle of glass at the top, and the face was always in that half circle, way too high for a real person to reach. Once, around 1 a.m., he followed it with his fingers and his eyes, pointing as it moved. He told my mom that it had gone into Mama's room. He even said it was outside our car once when we weren't at the house. Eventually, he stopped seeing it. Then, when my daughter began walking, she started saying the same things. She would run past the entryway as fast as she could, with a look of pure terror on her face. They don't see it anymore, but at the time, it creeped me the hell out. Story 26. I used to watch my 3-year-old niece overnight when her mom worked third shift. She had her own bedroom with her special toys, dress-up clothes, and things like that. She also has a sensory disorder and a learning disability, which can make her seem emotionally flat or distant at times, though she was always very loving toward my dog, my boyfriend, and me. One night, I woke up to her standing beside my bed. She was wearing a witch costume, holding a plastic knife from her play kitchen in one hand and my Yorkie in the other. She leaned in and whispered, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too." There was no emotion in her face or her voice, just these blank dead eyes. It scared the shit out of me. Story 27. This is my sister's story. When she was around 6 years old, my parents lived on a property out in the bush. One day she went outside to play and followed a lamb. After a while, she picked it up and started playing with it. Not long after, a little girl approached her, and they talked and played together for what my sister said felt like hours. Eventually, the little girl's father came over and said to my sister, "Little girl, your parents are looking for you. You'd better get home. they'll be getting worried. The little girl and her father then walked my sister back home, with my sister still holding the lamb. It wasn't until my sister was in her late 20s that she asked my mum, "Who was the little girl and the man who walked me home that day?" My mum replied, "No one walked you home. You came home by yourself, holding a little lamb." At the time, there were no other properties within walking distance of ours. When my sister thought back on it later, she also realized that the little girl and her father had been dressed in old colonial-style clothing. Story 28. Our son was 3 at the time, and he kept talking about a boy in the bathroom. Sometimes he would stop playing and say, "Did you hear that?" Then run off to the bathroom and tell us, "The boy in the bathroom keeps crying. We have to help him." Other times he would say, "Oh, it's okay, he's laughing," or we'd find him in there whispering. It was creepy enough that he genuinely believed this boy was there. But what made it worse was that friends would come over, walk in on their own, and ask me about our son upstairs laughing his head off when he wasn't even in the house. Eventually, there was no mention of the boy for months. Then one day, completely out of the blue, he came up to me and said, "The boy in the bathroom is a monster." I asked him why he thought that, and he said, "He has horns, and sand comes out of his mouth, and he said he lives with his friends in volcanoes." Story 29. When I was a child, I had an imaginary friend who followed me around. He was like my shadow, except not attached. Sometimes I would chase him, and he would fade into a closet. Over the years, I stopped seeing him, but others who have visited my home have claimed to see this unattached shadow, both inside and outside the house. When I was about 9, my family was leaving for a trip early in the morning. We were heading out at 4 a.m. As I walked toward the car, I saw a man standing between the house and the garage. Without saying a word, I walked into the darkness after him. My parents, completely confused, came looking for me. After a fruitless search, I described the man to them. 16 hours later, my estranged uncle died. The man I described matched my uncle's appearance. Years later, during a nighttime walk with my mother from one family member's home to another deep in the countryside, an old man appeared on the road ahead of us. It was so dark you could barely see your own hand. Yet he was oddly visible in the blackness. As we got closer, my mother went from apprehensive to panicked and grabbed me, rushing us back to the house. The man we had seen was the image of a long-dead family member, wearing the same clothes he was buried in. My mother has long insisted that people visit their loved ones hours before their deaths, warning that something is wrong. This included urging my father to visit his own father, who had been ill in the hospital for weeks. She has also been known to wake up and tell others in the house that a family member has died before the phone even rings. As children, my sister and I both heard what I can only describe as unearthly, beautiful singing in the night, only to later learn that someone close to us had died. My friends were often too afraid to spend the night at my house because many of them reported waking to see a man watching them from the window. Once, as a child, I grew angry and screamed at whatever these strange occurrences were, demanding that they stop. That night, my entire family woke to the sound of a woman sobbing. Animals also seem to have a habit of not dying, or not staying dead, around me, which I have found horrifying and, at times, deeply traumatizing. Story 30. My daughter was a premature baby, born at 23 weeks, and nearly passed away several times in her first 6 months. As she grew, she often said and did strange things, and unusual occurrences seemed to happen whenever she was around. One lighter moment happened when she was 3. It was summer, hot and humid, and as we got into the car, she said it felt hot and sticky, just like when I was in Mommy's tummy. When she was 2, her father passed away, and for years afterward, I would hear her in her room, seemingly having full conversations with someone. When I asked who she was talking to, she would say, "Daddy is here. He wants to see all my toys." She somehow knew things about her dad that I know for certain she was never told. She once spent a weekend at my mother's house, and my mom said that from the moment she arrived until she left, strange things kept happening. Car windows would roll down on their own, all of them at the same time, while she and my daughter sat on the porch. The doorbell rang multiple times during the night. The gas fireplace, which has an on-off switch, turned on randomly by itself. At one point, my daughter was in the kitchen, standing in front of the stove, and yelled for her grandmother. As my mom walked toward her, a large ceiling fan fixture above her crashed down. There have been countless other moments like these, too many to recount fully, but I believe that her near-death experiences and her time as a young child gave her the ability to see and attract things beyond what we can perceive. Story 31. When my nieces were 3 and 4, they shared a room together. They both kept talking about an old man with glowing eyes who lived in their closet. My sister brushed it off as a shared imaginary friend and active imaginations. But they began telling other people about him too. to the point that my sister's ex-husband asked if her dad was living with them, thinking maybe he was hiding in the closet during games of hide and seek. One night, in the middle of the night, my sister and her current husband were woken by terrified screams from both girls. They ran into the room and found them huddled together, clutching each other. In the middle of the room was a child-sized card table with 2 chairs. The girls said the old man with the glowing eyes was being scary and ordering them to sit at the table. They were convinced that if they sat down, something bad was going to happen. It still breaks my heart to think about it, even though it was years ago. Other strange things happened while they lived there, including things I personally witnessed. They moved out shortly after that. Thank God. My nieces still remember it, and they're adults now. Story 32. My son was about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years old, and he barely spoke. It was one of those stages where you had to decipher what he meant. He would often tell me, "Mommy, Abello and I fell in the snow." I would just reply, "Yes, yes, son," and laugh it off. I was always in a hurry, and besides, there is no snow where we live. I have never seen snow, and most likely never will. He repeated it so many times that one day I finally sat down with him. He said it again, and I asked him how it happened. I asked if they ate the lemon snow or dropped the lemon snow. He shook his head and said, "No, Mommy, Abello and I fell like this." Then he used his little fingers to act out people walking along the edge of a mountain and falling off a cliff. He said, "I was big and Abello was smaller. Then I came here with you, with my dad, with Abello." At the time, I thought it was funny and assumed he had a very active imagination. But later I remembered how, when my baby was born, my dad and my son would stare at each other for long moments. My dad used to say, "He looks at me like he knows me." I brushed it off as coincidence. Then I noticed that they share the same birthmarks, one on their back and another on their chest. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was all imagination, or maybe they really were brothers in another life. In the end, it's up to each person to decide whether it's possible or just a coincidence. Story 33. Okay, so here's my story. My sister and I both had night terrors when we were young. I'm 28 now, and I still have them. My mother called them fever dreams because they usually happened when we were sick. We would hallucinate things like the ceiling fan trying to kill us, or the closet turning into a giant mouth. We'd scream, cry, and be completely inconsolable for hours. The subjects of my sister's night terrors changed every time, but mine always followed the same pattern. When it happened, I would run from my room into my parents' room in the middle of the night, screaming, "Get them off! Get them off!" while frantically brushing at my pajamas, the way you would if something were crawling on you. Each time my parents would calm me down and put me back to bed. They chalked it up to night terrors and didn't think much of it. Fast forward 10 years. I'm a teenager, lying in my bed early in the evening, reading. I put my book down and look up at the ceiling, and it's moving. When I squint, I realize the ceiling is covered in thousands of baby spiders. They've crawled to each end of the ceiling, and many of them are dropping down, hanging on invisible threads, turning my bedroom into a gauntlet of spiders that feels impossible to escape without being covered in hundreds of tiny insects. After running into the hallway, flailing and panicking, I tried to spray my entire room with bug spray, but the spiders hatched at least 2 more times that I can remember, and it never stopped being terrifying. Those tiny spiders, almost invisible to the naked eye, are what I imagine were covering my 6-year-old body as I screamed, thrashed, and begged my parents for help. Instead, they took my hand, led me back into a room full of spiders, tucked me in, and told me it was just a bad dream. The moral of the story: sometimes you should believe your creepy kid. Story 34. About 2 years ago, my husband, our 5-year-old daughter Camberlyn, and I moved into a new house. When my husband went into what would be her room to set things up, he found a necklace in the corner. Thinking nothing of it, he gave it to Camberlyn, who was obsessed with jewelry at the time. About a month after we moved in, she started telling us that a girl named Sarah would sit in the corner of her room and cry. I was confused since the house had just been built before we moved in. Camberlyn said Sarah cried because of her necklace. Yesterday, I noticed Camberlyn walk into the room without the necklace on. She is 7 now, and she had never taken it off since the day she got it. When I asked her why she wasn't wearing it anymore, she said, "It was Sarah's. I gave it back to her so she would stop crying," and then walked away. Still unsettled, I called the company that built the house. not expecting any real answers. One of the men who had worked on our house told me that a coworker of his had a daughter named Sarah. He had given her a necklace that matched the exact description of the one Camberlyn wore. The father had taken it to be repaired because the chain had rusted. About a month later, the family died in a car accident. He also said the description of Sarah matched exactly how Camberlyn had described her. I'm still shaken, having just gotten off the phone. Apparently, everything is fine now. Camberlyn told me that after she gave Sarah the necklace, Sarah said, "Thank you. Now I can go tell Daddy that I found it." And then disappeared. Story 35. Christmas Day, years ago, my son had just turned 3. We went to my aunt's house, where she was hosting for my dad's side of the family. My dad had passed away when I was 15. My son parked himself by the front door and refused to come eat or join in. After a while, he came to get my aunt and me and said we needed to open the door because a man wanted to come in. We assumed it was his imagination, but he became agitated and said, "The tall man wants to come in." Then he ran into the living room and pointed straight at a photo of my dad. I had never told him my dad had died, and I had never shown him photos. In the picture, my dad was sitting down, with no indication of his height. He was 6'4". We opened the door for a few minutes, just in case. Story 36. My youngest would often tell me about her other grandma named Dot, who had purple hair and glasses. One day she told me that Dot loved the area we live in. She was 3, and I had no idea she even knew the name of the area. She also said they'd had a great time in France. We're in the United Kingdom, and again, I didn't know she even knew what France was. Then she asked if I'd like her to show me where Dot lived. I figured, why not? So we started walking in a direction we'd never gone before, with her chatting away the whole time. Suddenly she stopped in the street. Her eyes kind of glazed over, and she said, "She was here, but she's gone now. Let's go to nursery," then turned and started walking. We were standing right outside a funeral home. I may or may not have had a brief episode of internal screaming on the walk to nursery that day. Story 37. My friend's child was 3 when this happened. They asked me to babysit so they could go on a date. When I arrived, they told me he wouldn't come out of his room and wouldn't explain why. I knocked on his door and asked if I could come in. When he said okay, I walked in and saw him staring at the corner of the ceiling above the door. I asked, "Avery, are you okay?" He looked terrified and said, "The green man doesn't like you." A chill ran down my back because his voice sounded much deeper than usual. I asked, "The green man?" He nodded and pointed to the corner. I turned to look, but didn't see anything. By then, his parents were standing behind me, and I heard his mom gasp when he pointed. I asked her if she knew what he meant. She nodded and motioned for me to follow them into their bedroom. There, she and her husband told me they had both had the same nightmare a few days earlier about a green creature that said it was coming for their son. I've never had any paranormal experiences before. No ghosts, no UFOs, but the skin on my neck went ice cold, and I swear, I felt something brush past me. I asked what precautions they'd taken, if any, and they said none. After that night, they called in a holy person who cleansed the house with sage and incense, and they never had another visit from the green man, as far as I know. I lost touch with them a few years later, but I still think about that night. Story 38. When my son was around 3 or 4, I was getting him and his sister ready for bed. I was having a really hard time emotionally, though I don't remember why now. My kids are adults. As I was walking down the hallway with my daughter, my son came out of his room. The lights were off because I had already put him to bed. He stepped into the hallway, looked back into the dark room and said, "Okay." I looked down the hall, confused since it was just the 3 of us in the house, and asked him who he was talking to. He replied, "Aunt Sherry says she loves you." I froze for a moment, then looked into the room and said, "I love you too." Sherry was the name of my older sister, who passed away at 3 months old. I had never told my children about her. They were too young to understand. I never met her myself, as I was born 5 years after she died. My daughter also made comments when she was around 3 or 4 about her great-Grammy visiting her. She would describe a lady who came to talk to her sometimes, saying she wore a blue nightgown, sometimes yellow, sometimes purple. I had bought my grandmother nightgowns in those exact colors during the final stages of her cancer. When I was growing up, my grandmother would always ask me, "Are you my girl?" whenever she hugged me. My daughter told me the lady asked her the same question. I knew then it had to be my grandmother. She had passed away several years before my daughter was born. Story 39. Early one morning, when my daughter was 4 years old, I was awakened by her yelling, "Stop it, John, you're scaring me." There was real distress in her voice, And more alarming still, there were only the two of us in the house. I leapt out of bed and, in a few long steps, crossed the hall and shoved open her bedroom door. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed and looked startled by my sudden entrance. I quickly glanced around the room, but didn't see anything unusual. I asked, "What are you doing?" She replied, "I was just talking to Johnny. He came into play, but I don't want to today." Assuming she was playing pretend, I asked who Johnny was. She looked at me with an expression that suggested it was sad how slow I was and said, "This was Johnny's room before he got hit by a car." Story 40. It's so strange that so many people have had similar reincarnation-esque experiences. When I was about 5 years old, I had a fever of 105. I was told afterward that I was hallucinating and doing odd things, like waking suddenly from a deep sleep, picking flowers out of a vase and laying them on the floor one by one, or pointing at the middle of the room and talking about ballerinas. At one point, my mom was holding me, and I remember telling her that I wanted my other mom. She responded, "I am your mom," understandably upset given my behavior. I distinctly remember knowing that I had several mothers and picturing a middle-aged woman in a Victorian-style dress, someone I felt I had known much longer and who felt far more comforting to me. I've had other strange experiences since then, memories that don't seem to belong to me. I've thought about trying past life regression, but at the same time, I'm afraid to. Story 41. My son had been complaining about a man not letting him sleep in his room. He told me the man slept in his closet. I dismissed it as imagination, comforted him, and put him back to sleep, thinking nothing of it. Later, I was babysitting my friend's 18-month-old daughter, who was incredibly advanced. She wandered into my son's room to play. When I went to check on her, she was sitting in the corner, facing the wall, giggling and talking. It struck me as strange, but she was a baby, so I brushed it off. Another night, my son woke up screaming. He said he can't sleep with him in here, pointing at his closet. As he said it, the closet door slammed shut. It was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I grabbed my son, took him out of the room, and shut the door. Needless to say, we moved shortly after. There was plenty of other strange stuff that happened in that apartment, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Story 42. Not a parent, but when I was a kid, about 6 or 7, the house we lived in was haunted. One day my mom was walking across the landing when she heard me talking in my room. She came to my door and asked who I was talking to. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "The girl who used to live here. She doesn't like you." Mom brushed it off as childish rambling until that night. She was lying in bed trying to sleep when she suddenly felt like she was being attacked. The next morning, with no knowledge of what had happened, I walked into her room and said, "I told you she didn't like you. We only moved out last year and I'm still pretty young, so I remember a lot of this." Edit. I forgot to mention that the new owners were renovating the attic to make a new bedroom when they broke through a wall. Inside, they found a female skeleton, about 21 years old, with a bashed-in skull. In the 1800s, a girl who worked at the mill across the street disappeared. I reckon it was her, but who knows? Story 43. Not my child, but my sister. The house we lived in was awful. I hated it, and there was definitely something off about it. I have way more stories than I could ever recount about the crazy things that happened there. One that comes to mind is my dad saying, "Well, if this place is haunted, let's see them turn off the lights." And then, just like that, the power went out for about 5 seconds across the entire house. Crazy stuff like that happened all the time. The basement was basically the hub for all the creepy activity. It was also where my parents set up the toy room for my sister and me. She would have been a toddler, about 3 or 4, and I would have been around 8 or 9. I can barely remember all the details, but my mom has recounted the story to us many times. My sister had a habit of carrying a bunch of her toys all the way upstairs to the main floor, to the kitchen, where my mom would often be working or just relaxing. The kitchen was right at the top of the stairs from the basement, so my sister would sit there with her toys on the linoleum, just inside the kitchen, playing. One day, my mom was busy and pretty flustered when she stepped on one of my sister's toys and hurt herself. Already upset, she snapped at my sister and said something like, "Why don't you play downstairs in your toy room with these?" My sister burst into tears and cried, "No, Mommy, I can't. There's a man down there and he's scary. He won't let me play with my toys. He has Owies on his feet, Mommy, and he's scary." She kept rambling on through her tears. My mom was shaken by this, but then my sister turned and looked toward the open door leading down to the basement. She pointed and started screaming, "He's right there, Mommy! He's right there!" My mom scooped her up immediately and hurried my sister and me away from the door. I don't remember it clearly enough to recall more details, Sorry. Story 44. My parents' house was built in 1890 and is an old farmhouse. We moved there when I was 12, and I've always been convinced it's haunted by a family with 2 kids. I felt that way long before anyone else ever experienced anything. When my niece was little, maybe around 3 years old, she used to talk about a little boy on the stairs. She said she saw him often and would ask who he was. My brother, her dad, and my parents tried to tell her she was imagining it because they didn't want to scare her. A few years later, she'd forgotten all about the little boy, and none of us talked about it either. Then my nephew was born. Once he could talk, he started asking who the little boy on the stairs was. We had never mentioned it to him. My niece hadn't mentioned it either, as she lived with her mother 2 hours away and didn't visit often. He was just as insistent as my niece had been that there was a little boy on the stairs. To get from the garage entrance to the kitchen, you have to go through the laundry room. When my nephew was a bit older, he came in one day while my mom was in the kitchen and casually asked why the ghosts were arguing in the laundry room. I don't know what my mom told him, but she was absolutely terrified. A lot of strange things have happened in that house, and they still do. Unfortunately, the town is small and rural, and the records aren't online. So I've never had the chance to research its history without digging through old newspapers, which I never had time to do. Story 45. Not a parent, but last year, when my grandpa passed away, my mother was absolutely devastated. We got back from the funeral close to midnight, and my then 7-year-old sister was asleep. So my dad carried her to bed, tucked her in, and closed the door. My mom stayed up for a few more hours, putting up pictures of her dad in her bedroom and lighting a candle for him. The next morning, I stayed home from school to help out because my mom was in such bad shape. I was doing my sister's hair in the living room while my mom was searching for her keys. My sister said, "Mom." My mom answered, "Yeah." My sister said, Grandpa says to take all that stuff down. He says, "Stop looking at my pictures." And he says to stop crying, and he loves you. Needless to say, my mom was really freaked out. This happened on 3 different occasions, with my sister relaying things my grandpa was apparently unhappy about. That included my mom not eating, not calling my grandmother to check on her, and that he was cold, which hit my mom the hardest. Story 46. When my daughter was around 2 or 3 years old, I was sitting in the bathroom scrolling through Facebook on my phone. She was standing near the open door, just doing her own thing. As I scrolled, I came across a post from an old acquaintance from my hometown. We now live in different parts of the country, and I hadn't spoken to this person since my teenage years. They weren't part of my life at all anymore. As I was silently reading his post in my head, my daughter suddenly said, out of nowhere, "Who's Dave?" I froze and immediately looked over at her and said, "What did you say?" She repeated, "Who's Dave?" I asked her why she said that, but she didn't really have an answer. The post I was reading at that exact moment was written by someone named Dave, a person I hadn't spoken to in 10 to 15 years. It really freaked me out. We weren't talking to each other. We were both doing our own thing, and she suddenly said his name, as if she somehow tapped into my thoughts while I was reading. I tried to explain it logically, but she didn't know this person or anyone named Dave. There was no reason for her to randomly say that name, and it wasn't even part of her vocabulary. I'll always remember it, even now, 10 or 11 years later. It made me think that children might be more open to things that fade as we grow older. It was the strangest woo-woo moment I've ever experienced, and it left me genuinely baffled. Thanks you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.